What we'll now talk about is the eligibility for the tax credit in the Canadian Income Tax Act. So this is legislation that's passed by our elected officials, people that you or I might have voted for, passed into law and then handed to the Canada Revenue Agency, who's more like a police officer, who applies that law that's been passed by our elected officials, but really has no ability or mandate to create its own laws. We're going to talk about the importance of that, because we're going to start talking about this base law that is really all that ever needs to be followed, and how the Canada Revenue Agency interprets this legislation to apply it to the program. Okay. In the front of your handouts, there's a brochure. It says, Simplifying the SR&ED Tax Credit Program. I believe this brochure is really all that people need when they're first starting out to determine if, in fact, they've got an eligible project, from a technology perspective, before we get into any costs or issues there. So right now, we're on page B1 of the handouts, or the very back page of your brochure. And what the Income Tax Act says, and this definition is an international definition. You'll find it in the Canadian Income Tax Act, you'll find it in the US's IRS Code, you'll find it in England's or United Kingdom's Inland Revenue Service, and most other countries that have SR&ED credits, which is most industrialized countries now, use the identical definition here of SR&ED. So it's a quote, systematic investigation or search. And each of these terms is actually defined in many cases litigated. The courts have said, what is a systematic investigation versus a non-systematic investigation? It's got to be carried out in a field of science or technology. And it's got to be done by means of experiment or analysis. It could be basic research, where you don't have a specific application. I don't see that too often. It could be applied research, where you do have a specific application, which is what most of it would fall under. And very importantly, the term experimental development was added to the Canadian Income Tax Act to clarify that it goes beyond what you would think of as pure academic SR&ED. So what they say on the very back is experimental development is work undertaken for the purpose of achieving a technological advancement. So this will be a key term that we revisit through the rest of the morning here on eligibility. Everything has to aim at a technological advancement. Okay? For the purpose of creating new or improving existing materials, devices, products, or processes, including incremental improvements there too, is what they say. But basically what they're saying is you could be developing a brand new product or process, or taking an existing product or process and improving it in some quantifiable or measurable way. The Act then goes on to say there's 7 to 8 types of work that, as long as you needed to perform these types of activities in order to resolve one of your stated technological uncertainties, this work is eligible. The first 4 are the obvious ones: the engineering, the design, the operations, research, any mathematical analysis that you would do. So people tend to catch that intuitively when I say, what's part of your research process? As we go down the list, you tend to have to apply a little more judgment in various scenarios. Any computer programming that we did to answer a question, pre-stated uncertainty, would be eligible. If we had to do the programming for a commercial need and it wasn't necessary to resolve the uncertainty, that would be part of the commercial work. So there's often judgment involved on when do we switch from experimental development or production to commercial development or production. And we'll talk about how you can define that and optimize that. Any data gathering that we do after we define an uncertainty is eligible. If I say, well, here's one of my problems, I have to start gathering data to answer this, that would be in. Any data that I've gathered in the past before I had that uncertainty that I can now use, hey, I can have the results of production reports or something that we've collected in the past that I can now use, does not automatically become eligible. It only becomes eligible after the point that I appear to have defined the uncertainty. So we'll talk about how the CRA may review that, ask you for evidence of when you first defined the uncertainty and documented it, and then the costs after that point tend to be eligible. Okay? And probably the big one here is testing. This is the one where you get into a lot of judgment calls and negotiations with the Canada Revenue Agency, I find. The Act says that any testing that's necessary to resolve the uncertainty is in. So often the question is, well, you know, what's a reasonable amount of testing? 5 units, 50 units, 500 units? And then that depends on other things. If you have companies that have sophisticated testing methods, like Six Sigma quality standards or something like that, they may start talking about confidence intervals and tolerances and decide that they need 2 or 3 million units of testing. And what I found is if they can statistically support that, that would be the amount. Okay? So there is no right answer on this. These are areas that start to demand professional judgment in all cases. So the more you document on your sample size, the more likely it is to be accepted, particularly as it gets into larger numbers. The very last one is listed in the Income Tax Act, psychological research. But I like to qualify it. And the key issue there is that psychological research is in fact a social science. So it's actually excluded from the field of science and technology. So the Act puts it in and it actually excludes it in another section. The reason being is that they've allowed psychological research basically just for one industry, which is the pharmaceuticals industry, and really just at one stage when they do the final, I think it's called HBB testing, where they test new drugs on human beings. In addition to the chemical and biological tests, they do psychological tests that the government agrees is concurrent with the chemistry and biology and is included. But in most other industries, particularly software, you don't want to claim psychology as a technological advancement. And it sounds funny, but it gets misinterpreted an awful lot. People think they're making something more intuitive or something like that as the basis for the technological objectives. And again, that tends to start you on the wrong foot. The Act currently lists a number of things that are not SR&ED. And they're talking about rewriting the definition of SR&ED in the Income Tax Act to remove these things, because the argument is, if you understand the definition, these things would be intuitive. These are just a list of examples. They're not really laws. They're just examples of things that would be contrary. Commercial production is really any work that you're doing after you appear to have resolved the last of the significant technological uncertainties you've stated. You say, I've got these 4 problems. I've done X number of samples. I think I've got this worked out. And you keep going and producing the product and maybe selling some. They'll say, well, now the SR&ED project is closed after the point where you appear to have resolved the uncertainties, and you've moved to the commercial point. And they expect the claimant to define that in all cases. They say, you tell us when you think in your professional judgment you've moved from the point of technological uncertainty to commercial. So they want a self-assessment of that. Any market research or sales promotion. Again, this tends to be a gray area on what's market research and what's data collection. And they give examples. For the food industry, it'd be a great one, where if I'm developing a new kind of product, let's say I'm Nabisco and I'm developing a new granola bar, if I just go out to the supermarket and I give samples to people and say, hey, why don't you rate this 1 to 10? CRA would tend to say that's just market promotion. Okay? If instead, while I'm developing the formulations, what they call the formula ingredient manufacturing specs, I use skilled organoleptic testers. I put them in separate rooms and they rate things like bitterness, sweetness, mouthfeel, and a whole bunch of other criteria, and then compare those to develop the formulation. CRA says that would be experimental development and not market research. So again, the more systematically you tend to approach certain activities, the more likely they are to be systematic investigation as opposed to market research or other activities. Again, there's really no right or wrong on these. There's no hard set rules, but they're going to apply judgment or require you to apply judgment in each case. Quality control or routine testing is, again, just an example of as soon as we move from experimental production to commercial production, things like quality control where I take every 1,000th widget off the line to make sure my machines are still in spec would not tend to be eligible. Research in the social sciences and the humanities is a big one. And what we've really said there is that anything like psychology, accounting, how to run my business, economics are social sciences. And they may be rife with uncertainties, but they're not technological uncertainties. So they would not qualify for tax credits. Anything that we can't put a number to, if we want to make something better or nicer, or things that are more qualitative than quantitative, run the risk of being deemed style changes. Right? I want to make this paint look more pleasing. If I'm a resin or paint developer, a chemicals developer, some kind of coatings researcher, that wouldn't be eligible. If I said, well, I want it to have this level of wear at this level of light spectrum when I do my Florida tests, and ultimately I want the chromography of the color to be at certain levels, at certain angles, and I test all those things systematically, again, that would be eligible research. So if we can quantify things like colors with chromography rather than judgmental estimates, we're probably doing systematic investigation as opposed to trial and error stuff. And you want to stay away from the style changes. Very importantly, there is an absolute deadline for filing these claims. There's other deadlines that work around this, or planning opportunities, but the absolute deadline for a corporation to file a claim is 18 months from the corporate year end. Normally a tax return is due 6 months after a corporation's year end. The Income Tax Act gives you another 12 months to amend any claims that you've done if you've already filed a tax return, or to file the tax return up until that point. We'll talk about some quick strategies that you can have for doing that. Some of the fields of science that are included would be chemicals research, and we have examples of eligible projects. If you go to our website, you can download them. Food and life sciences, machinery development, software, tools and dies, plastics, and engineering. All of these have examples that are, our examples are based on government published examples that are listed in various papers, and they tend to be developed by the Canada Revenue Agency scientists or engineers, what they call technical reviewers, along with representatives from industry. Okay, getting into the requirements now. SR&ED can be related to the business of a taxpayer. It could be the main focus of the company, or improving any of existing products or processes, as we've said before. What we want to do is, as we go through, we'll start to illustrate areas where there could be co-ownership or co-production and things like that, and how we might plan on that. So we're going to revisit that issue. The start of Section B provides a list of Canada Revenue Agency guides and bulletins that we're going to refer to throughout the rest of the course. The first are what are called information circulars, and they all deal with technological eligibility. So does this work qualify from a science or technology standpoint? And we have information circulars for various industries: machinery, software, plastics. The next is IT 151, which deals with financial eligibility. If we assume we've got eligible projects from the ICs above, what are the rules on wages, materials, work outside of Canada, overhead allocations? So again, IT 151 provides fairly good detail on each of those financial issues. The last group of papers that have become more prevalent in the last 10 years are something called application policy papers. And what those are issue-specific papers where an issue has come up that the Canada Revenue Agency believes there's inadequate direction in either the ICs or the ITs to deal with that specific issue. And what they tend to do is write a paper dealing specifically with that issue and their policy on treatment of it, along with examples. They tend to have less weight or authority in the CRA's eyes than the other two formal papers, but they tend to go out very quickly and be updated quickly whenever the policy changes, versus changes to the ITs or ICs, which are more formal and take a longer time to turn around.